What if the most important ingredient in human history was not fire, was not the wheel, but something animals discovered millions of years before we did, and simply never bothered to tell us? This is the history of salt, a mineral so ordinary it sits forgotten on every dinner table, and yet it has started wars, funded empires, ended plagues of spoiled food, and once, quite literally, been worth its exact weight in gold. Right now, it is probably within arm's reach of you, and almost nobody knows the extraordinary story behind it. If stories like this genuinely fascinate you, subscribe now. 11 more chapters are waiting, and this is only the beginning. Long before humans existed, animals across every continent had already solved a biological problem. We did not yet know we shared. Bodies need sodium to survive, and plants alone rarely provide enough of it. So herds of herbivores developed an instinct, migrating sometimes for days toward specific patches of exposed mineral deposits called salt licks. Watch closely enough, and you will see the same behavior today, essentially unchanged, in grasslands around the world. Early humans, watching these migrations with the same hunting instincts that had kept us alive for millennia, noticed something worth investigating. Why did entire herds detour toward this one unremarkable patch of ground? Curiosity, as it so often does in this story, led somewhere unexpected. When early humans finally tasted the crystalline mineral themselves, something in the body's own chemistry responded immediately. A reaction that predates language, predates agriculture, predates almost everything we consider civilization. But the truly transformative discovery came later, likely by accident, when someone noticed something even stranger. Meat rubbed with this same mineral did not rot the way untreated meat did. Think about what that single observation actually meant. For the first time in human history, food did not have to be eaten immediately or lost to decay. It could be kept, carried, traded, stored against a hungry winter. A single mineral had just handed early humans something close to time travel for their food supply. Word of this discovery, historians and archaeologists believe, likely emerged independently in multiple regions: inland mineral springs, coastal evaporation pools, underground deposits, each population stumbling onto the same fundamental chemistry through entirely separate paths. Nature, it seems, was offering the same gift to whichever humans happened to be paying attention. What makes this especially remarkable is how differently each of these paths would eventually unfold. A coastal community harvesting crystals from sun-warmed tide pools would end up with a completely different relationship to this mineral than an inland group chipping it laboriously from solid rock. Same chemistry, same craving, wildly different histories about to begin. Once discovered, this humble mineral would never again fade into the background. It was about to become one of the most fiercely pursued substances in human history, starting with a civilization already obsessed with preserving things forever. Would you trust your eternal soul to a mineral you scraped off the bottom of a dry lake bed? Ancient Egypt did, and remarkably, it worked exactly as they hoped. In the desert basin, known as the Wadi Natron, workers gathered a naturally occurring salt compound called natron, harvested from lake beds that dried and reformed with the seasons. It looked unremarkable, but Egyptian priests had discovered something extraordinary about it. Packed carefully around a prepared body, natron drew out moisture with such efficiency that it could halt decomposition almost entirely, preserving human remains for what priests believed would be an eternal afterlife. This was not simple folk superstition. Modern forensic and archaeological analysis has confirmed that natron genuinely does work as an effective desiccant, drawing water from tissue through basic, verifiable chemistry. Egyptian embalmers had, through centuries of careful observation, essentially developed a functional preservation science. Without ever using that word, and without any concept of the bacteria their process was quietly starving of the moisture they needed to survive. But salt's importance in Egypt extended far beyond royal tombs. Along the Nile, ordinary fishermen salted their daily catch on wooden racks, a practical technique that let a single good day's fishing feed a family for weeks rather than hours. Multiply that across an entire civilization, and you begin to understand something historians increasingly emphasize. Egypt's remarkable population growth and stability may owe as much to this humble preservation technique As to the Nile's famous annual floods, here is a detail that might surprise you. Archaeological excavations at sites like Amarna have revealed entire neighborhoods organized specifically around salt and natron processing, furnaces, storage vessels, administrative records, suggesting something closer to organized industry than scattered household practice. This was not incidental to Egyptian civilization. It was infrastructure, and Egypt did not keep this resource to itself. Natron and salted goods traveled along trade routes reaching far beyond Egyptian borders, carried by merchants who understood they were selling something genuinely irreplaceable. The ability to make food, and even the human body itself, resist the passage of time. Egyptian scribes even developed detailed administrative systems for tracking natron harvests and trade quantities, treating this mineral with the same bureaucratic seriousness applied to grain or gold, a clear sign of just how strategically important it had become to the functioning of the state itself. Egypt had shown the ancient world what was possible when a civilization took this mineral seriously, but an entirely different civilization, thousands of miles to the east, was about to demonstrate something even more astonishing, that salt was not just something you found on the surface. Sometimes, if you were patient and clever enough, you could drill for it deep beneath the earth itself. Here is something that should sound impossible. Over 2,000 years ago, workers in ancient China drilled wells more than 3,000 feet deep, using nothing but bamboo, human muscle, and remarkable patience. And what they found down there was not just brine. It was an energy source nobody expected. In the Sichuan Basin, ancient engineers developed a percussion drilling technique, using a weighted bamboo pole, repeatedly raised and dropped to slowly bore through solid rock. This was not a quick process. Some of these wells took years, sometimes decades, of continuous drilling to reach workable brine deposits far beneath the surface. The patience and engineering sophistication this required genuinely rivals achievements we typically associate with far more recent history. Once workers struck brine, they faced a new challenge. How do you lift mineral-rich water from thousands of feet underground? Their solution involved long bamboo cables threaded through the borehole, drawing up sealed bamboo buckets filled with brine, a slow, laborious, but remarkably effective system that let this civilization access salt reserves no other ancient culture could reach. But it is what happened next that genuinely startled early Chinese engineers. Alongside the brine, some wells released something else entirely, flammable natural gas, seeping up from the same deep deposits. Rather than treating this as a hazard to avoid, Sichuan engineers did something remarkably resourceful. They captured this gas, channeled it through bamboo pipes, and used it to fuel the very furnaces evaporating their brine into usable salt. Think about what that actually represents. Over 2,000 years before anyone had a term for it, Chinese engineers had built a functioning, integrated energy system, extracting fuel and raw material from the same source, using one to process the other, entirely self-contained. It is one of history's earliest known examples of industrial energy efficiency, discovered by workers who simply refused to waste something useful. As this technology matured, the Sichuan Basin transformed into a genuinely massive production landscape. Dozens, eventually hundreds, of wells and evaporation facilities operated simultaneously, drawing the attention of a government eager to tax this valuable, reliable commodity. Salt taxation became a significant and steady source of imperial revenue, pattern that, as you will see throughout this documentary, would repeat itself across nearly every civilization salt ever touched. Remarkably, some of these ancient drilling and evaporation techniques persisted for centuries, remaining in active use well into the modern industrial era, a rare example of ancient technology proving so effective that later generations saw little reason to abandon it. As China's salt industry expanded, long roads and rivers reaching the entire empire, another civilization, far to the west, was quietly discovering its own use for this mineral, one that would leave a permanent mark on an entire language. Have you ever wondered where the word salary actually comes from? The answer connects directly to Roman soldiers, an ancient road, and a mineral so essential the empire built infrastructure specifically to move it. Rome's earliest significant salt source sat along the coast near Ostia, where evaporation pans converted seawater into a steady, essential supply. But a coastal resource is only useful if you can move it inland to where people actually live. So Rome built a road specifically for this purpose, stretching from the coast toward the growing capital. Historians call it the Via Salaria, quite literally, the Salt Road. This was not a minor detail of Roman infrastructure. The Via Salaria became one of the empire's most important arteries, and its existence reveals something significant about Roman priorities. This civilization considered reliable salt access important enough to justify a dedicated, engineered route stretching for miles. Roman soldiers, meanwhile, received salt as part of their military compensation, alongside coin. While historians debate the precise details of this arrangement, and whether it was literally the entire wage or simply a valuable allowance, the linguistic legacy is undeniable. The Latin word for this salt, allowance, salarium, evolved directly into our modern word salary, meaning that every time you discuss your paycheck, you are unknowingly referencing this ancient mineral. As Rome's empire expanded, so did its appetite for salt. It preserved meat for military campaigns fought far from any reliable food supply. It transformed fresh fish into garum, a pungent, intensely flavored sauce that became genuinely ubiquitous across Roman cuisine, exported by the amphora load to provinces throughout the Mediterranean, and it filled the pantries of ordinary Roman households, who depended on salted provisions to survive the gaps between harvests. Rome, characteristically, also recognized an opportunity. The state established formal control over salt pricing and production, generating consistent revenue from a commodity every single citizen needed regardless of circumstance. When salt prices rose too sharply, contemporary accounts describe genuine public frustration, an early example of a pattern that would recur throughout salt's history, right up through revolutions fought centuries later. Roman engineers also expanded salt production well beyond Italy itself, establishing new evaporation works along conquered coastlines from Iberia to North Africa, ensuring this essential resource remained available even as the empire's borders stretched further than any previous civilization had managed to sustain. As Rome's Western Empire eventually crumbled, its extensive network of salt roads did not simply vanish. Some routes remained in use for centuries, quietly outlasting the empire that built them. But the story of salt in Europe was only just beginning. Far to the south, across an ocean of sand, an entirely different and far more dramatic salt economy was reaching its own extraordinary peak. What could possibly be worth its exact weight in gold? 4 centuries, along one of history's most punishing trade routes. The answer was disarmingly simple: salt. Deep within the Sahara, at remote sites like Tagaza, workers cut massive rectangular slabs directly from ancient dried lake beds, exposed rock salt formed over thousands of years. These were not small quantities. Entire slabs, some weighing dozens of pounds, were carefully balanced onto patient camels and prepared for a journey that could stretch well over 1,000 miles across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Caravans carrying this precious cargo sometimes numbered in the thousands of camels, navigating by stars across a landscape with almost no reliable landmarks, facing genuine risks of dehydration, disorientation, and death with every single crossing. This was not casual commerce. It was one of the most demanding logistical operations in the pre-industrial world, undertaken specifically because what waited at the other end made the risk worthwhile. That destination was West Africa, home to gold deposits so rich it would eventually make regional rulers legendary across the medieval world. And here is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. In the region abundant in gold but almost entirely lacking natural salt deposits, and in a desert abundant in salt but lacking gold entirely, two civilizations had developed complementary scarcities. The resulting trade, according to numerous historical accounts, sometimes saw salt and gold exchanged in quantities of genuinely equivalent value. This trade did not just move minerals, it built cities. Timbuktu, positioned at a crucial crossroads of these trans-Saharan routes, grew into a genuinely cosmopolitan center of trade and, remarkably, scholarship, its markets and libraries funded substantially by the steady flow of salt moving south and gold moving north. Manuscripts still preserved to date testified to a level of intellectual sophistication that surprised European travelers who eventually documented the city's wealth. The Mali Empire, and later others across the region, built genuine imperial power on this foundation. Historical accounts describe rulers whose wealth astonished foreign visitors, wealth substantially derived from controlling and taxing this remarkable cross-desert exchange. It is a chapter of history rarely taught alongside Rome or medieval Europe, despite representing one of the most sophisticated trading civilizations of its era. The caravans kept moving for centuries, salt flowing steadily south, gold flowing steadily north, each journey a calculated gamble against a merciless desert. But even as this remarkable trade network flourished, a very different kind of salt economy was emerging across the Mediterranean, one built not on desert caravans, but on shallow coastal water, careful evaporation, and the fierce commercial ambitions of a small island republic. Would a city genuinely go to war over salt? Venice, one of history's most sophisticated trading powers, did exactly that more than once. Venice's earliest wealth was not built on the exotic silks and spices we typically associate with the city. It began with something far more mundane, shallow evaporation pans scattered across the Venetian lagoon, converting seawater into salt through patient solar evaporation. This unglamorous industry generated the initial capital that would eventually fund Venice's transformation into a genuine Mediterranean superpower. As Venice's ambitions grew, so did its need for salt beyond what its own modest lagoon could produce. The Republic began securing salt production rights and trading agreements across the wider Mediterranean, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through considerably more forceful means. Venetian authorities understood something clearly. Controlling this essential commodity meant controlling leverage over every community and kingdom that depended on it. This pursuit inevitably created rivals. Other Italian maritime republics, along with various Mediterranean powers, recognized the same strategic value in salt production and distribution. Historical records document genuine military conflicts, several substantially motivated by competition over valuable salt-producing coastal territories, a reminder that this humble mineral could provoke consequences considerably more severe than a simple trade dispute. Venice's approach to salt reveals something important about how the Republic operated more broadly. It did not just produce salt. It built an entire commercial infrastructure around ensuring steady supply, competitive pricing, and reliable distribution throughout its expanding trading network. Salt effectively became one of the foundational commodities, underwriting Venice's broader commercial empire, alongside its far more celebrated luxury trades. By the time Venice reached its commercial peak, its merchant fleets dominated significant portions of Mediterranean shipping, carrying salt alongside spices, textiles, and glass to ports throughout the known world. The steady, reliable revenue from this less glamorous commodity provided a genuinely stabilizing economic foundation beneath the more visible luxury trades that made Venice legendary. Even Venice's famous shipbuilding industry depended indirectly on salt, since preserved provisions were essential for the long voyages its merchant vessels regularly undertook. In this way, the same unglamorous mineral that funded the Republic's rise also quietly sustained the maritime commerce that made it famous, a connection few visitors to Venice's glittering canals would ever think to consider. Salt taught Venice, and by extension, much of medieval Europe, a lesson that would repeat throughout this documentary. Essential commodities generate power precisely because everyone needs them, regardless of wealth or status. Control the supply, and you control considerable leverage over an entire society. It is a lesson European monarchs were about to take to an extreme that would eventually provoke genuine revolutionary anger. What tax was so despised that historians consider it a genuine contributing factor to one of history's most consequential revolutions? In France, it was a tax on something every single household absolutely needed: salt. The Gabelle, as this tax became known, required French households to purchase a minimum mandatory quantity of salt directly from royal warehouses, at prices the crown controlled entirely. Worse, the rate varied dramatically by region. meaning neighboring provinces who pay wildly different prices for the exact same essential mineral, creating a confusing, deeply resented patchwork of inequality across the kingdom. Naturally, this created powerful incentives for smuggling. Enterprising individuals, known as falsoniers, risked severe punishment, moving untaxed salt across provincial borders, and royal enforcement agents called Jabelus patrolled the countryside specifically hunting these smugglers. Historical records describe genuinely severe consequences for those caught, including forced labor, and, in serious cases, execution, a stark illustration of how seriously the crown treated any threat to this essential revenue stream. The resentment this tax generated did not simply fade with time. It accumulated, generation after generation, becoming one of many grievances that would eventually converge into revolutionary anger by the late 18th century. When the French Revolution finally erupted, the Gabelle was among the first taxes abolished, a symbolic and practical acknowledgement of just how deeply this particular injustice had embedded itself in popular consciousness. Meanwhile, salt was quietly solving a very different problem across northern Europe. Herring, caught in enormous quantities from North Sea waters, spoiled within hours, unless preserved immediately. Fishing communities developed sophisticated salting and barreling techniques that let this abundant catch feed inland populations throughout entire winters, becoming a dietary staple, particularly important during religious fasting periods, when meat was forbidden, and where coastlines were not available. Europe found salt underground instead. Central European mountain regions developed substantial mining operations, extracting solid rock salt from deep mountain seams. These landlocked deposits built genuinely prosperous mining towns, proving that this essential mineral's economic power was not limited to coastal civilizations alone. These mountain mining communities developed their own sophisticated guild systems, carefully documenting extraction quantities and quality standards, evidence of surprisingly advanced resource management practiced centuries before anything resembling modern industrial regulation existed anywhere else in Europe. Salt, by the close of the medieval period, had touched nearly every corner of European life, taxed by kings, smuggled by desperate villagers, mined from mountains, and hauled from the sea to feed entire nations through harsh winters. But Europe's sailors were about to carry salt's preservation power somewhere it had never gone before. Across an ocean, toward continents nobody in Europe yet knew existed. How do you sail 4 months across open ocean with no possibility of restocking food along the way? The answer that made the age of exploration genuinely possible was not a navigational instrument. It was salt. European ships venturing into the Atlantic faced a fundamental logistical problem no amount of ambition could solve on its own. Fresh food simply could not survive weeks or months at sea. The solution, refined over generations, involved packing ships with barrels of salted meat and fish, preserved sustenance capable of remaining edible for remarkably long durations. Without this technology, the extended voyages that defined this entire era of exploration would have been physically impossible. As explorers pushed further into the Atlantic, they stumbled onto something that would reshape European food economics for centuries. Extraordinarily rich cod fishing grounds off distant northern coastlines. Fishing crews developed an efficient system, splitting and salting their catch directly aboard ship, producing salt cod in genuinely massive quantities that could be transported back to European markets. This discovery had consequences far beyond simple commerce. Salt cod became a dietary staple across Catholic Europe, particularly valuable given religious dietary restrictions that forbade meat on numerous days throughout the calendar year. Entire regional cuisines eventually formed around this preserved fish, traditions that, remarkably, remain culturally significant in several countries today. Salted provisions did not just feed exploration voyages, they fed the earliest colonial settlements that followed. New arrivals, facing genuinely unfamiliar and often hostile environments, relied heavily on salted supplies, while they worked to establish reliable local food sources. Colonial administrators understood clearly that adequate salt access could determine whether a fledgling settlement survived its first difficult years or collapsed entirely. Some of the earliest colonial industries established in newly reached territories were, unsurprisingly, salt-making operations adapted from techniques carried across the ocean and modified to suit unfamiliar local conditions. This was not a minor detail of colonial history. It represented a direct technological transplant, a piece of Old World chemistry essential to New World survival. Naval powers, meanwhile, recognized salt's strategic military value with equal seriousness. Provisioning a fleet for campaigns required enormous quantities of salted meat and fish, and historians note that a nation's capacity to reliably supply its navy with preserved food was, in a very real sense, a measure of its broader military and economic strength during this period. As transatlantic trade networks, salt and salted goods flowed continuously in both directions, part of a genuinely global commercial system unlike anything that had existed before. But even as salt enabled this age of exploration and expansion, a different kind of revolution was quietly beginning in European laboratories, one that would transform this ancient mineral from a food preservative into something entirely unexpected, an industrial chemical. What if salt was not primarily a food ingredient at all, but a chemical key capable of unlocking glass, soap, paper, and eventually clean drinking water for entire cities? By the late 18th century, chemists were about to find out. European industry faced a growing supply problem. Soda ash, essential for producing glass and soap, traditionally came from burning specific plants, a slow and increasingly inadequate source for a rapidly industrializing continent. French chemists, working to solve this shortage, discovered they could produce synthetic soda ash by reacting ordinary salt with sulfuric acid and limestone. This process, while messy and chemically crude by later standards, marked salt's genuine transformation from dinner-table mineral into industrial raw material. This breakthrough triggered a wave of continued refinement. Rival chemists developed increasingly efficient methods for the same basic transformation, competition driving genuine innovation across the growing chemical industry. Glassmakers and soap makers, previously constrained by limited natural soda ash supplies, suddenly had access to abundant, affordable synthetic alternatives, enabling significant expansion across numerous downstream manufacturing sectors. But the truly transformative breakthrough arrived when engineers discovered they could pass electrical current directly through salt brine, a process called electrolysis. This elegant reaction simultaneously produced two entirely different, genuinely valuable chemicals: caustic soda, essential for soap and textile manufacturing, and chlorine gas, a substance about to prove remarkably significant for reasons nobody initially anticipated. That significance became clear when engineers began adding carefully measured chlorine to municipal water supplies. The results were dramatic. Cities that adopted chlorinated water treatment saw waterborne disease rates plummet, sometimes within just a few years of implementation. Public health historians consider this one of the single most impactful interventions in the entire history of urban sanitation, and it traces directly back to ordinary table salt. Salt-derived chemistry did not stop there. It found its way into textile processing, paper manufacturing, and countless other industrial applications, becoming a genuinely foundational raw material for the broader industrial revolution. Rather than a niche curiosity, factories dependent on these salt-derived chemicals multiplied across industrializing nations, employing thousands and generating substantial economic activity built entirely on this humble mineral's newly discovered chemical versatility. By the close of the 19th century, salt had quietly completed an extraordinary transformation. It remained essential on dinner tables, exactly as it had been for thousands of years, but it had simultaneously become indispensable to modern industrial civilization in ways our ancient ancestors, salting their first preserved meat beside a campfire, could never have possibly imagined. Could a mineral genuinely help build a canal that transformed an entire nation's economy? In America, the answer is a resounding yes, and most people have never heard the story. In upstate New York, early American settlers, guided partly by local indigenous knowledge, discovered natural brine springs near what would become Syracuse. Simple evaporation operations sprang up around these springs, modest at first, but growing steadily as demand for reliable domestic salt production increased across an expanding young nation. still largely dependent on imported supplies. As this Onondaga salt region grew into a genuinely significant production center, a familiar problem emerged. How do you move a heavy, bulky commodity efficiently across considerable inland distances? The answer contributed directly to one of America's most consequential infrastructure projects. When planners proposed a canal connecting the Great Lakes region to the Hudson River, reliable salt transportation was among the practical economic justifications supporting this ambitious, expensive undertaking. The resulting waterway dramatically reduced shipping costs and time, and salt was among its earliest and most consistent cargoes. Historians studying this canal's broader economic impact consistently note that it did not just move salt efficiently. It catalyzed westward settlement, connected previously isolated regional economies, and helped establish trade patterns that shaped American development for generations afterward. Beneath the American Midwest, meanwhile, geological surveys revealed something genuinely staggering: vast underground salt deposits, remnants of ancient, evaporated seas, extending across enormous underground areas. Mining companies developed increasingly sophisticated extraction operations, eventually creating some of the largest underground salt mines anywhere in the world, chambers so extensive that visitors sometimes compare navigating them to exploring an entirely separate underground landscape. As American railroads expanded across the continent through the following decades, salt distribution transformed again. What once took weeks by wagon or canal boat could now reach frontier settlements in days, supporting westward expansion by ensuring reliable access to this essential preservation mineral even in genuinely remote locations. Salt blocks also became standard agricultural equipment, supplementing the nutritional needs of cattle across America's rapidly expanding ranching industry. By the turn of the 20th century, America had become one of the world's most significant salt-producing nations, its industry built on the same fundamental principles ancient civilizations had discovered thousands of years earlier, simply executed at a scale those earlier civilizations could never have imagined. But Salt's story was far from finished. Its next chapter would move from mines and canals into laboratories, hospitals, and eventually the human bloodstream itself. Could dissolving ordinary salt in water genuinely save a dying patient's life? 19th century physicians, faced with devastating cholera outbreaks, discovered the answer was yes, and it remains one of medicine's simplest, most important treatments today. During severe cholera epidemics, physicians observed that patients frequently died not directly from infection, but from catastrophic fluid and electrolyte loss caused by severe dehydration. Medical researchers eventually developed intravenous saline solution, essentially purified salt water, as a treatment. The results were often dramatic, sometimes stabilizing critically ill patients within hours. This straightforward intervention, refined over subsequent decades, remains one of the most frequently administered treatments in hospitals worldwide today. The reason saline works so effectively connects to something happening constantly inside every human body. Sodium ions play an essential role in nerve signal transmission and muscle function at the cellular level, a fundamental biological mechanism scientists gradually mapped out through the following century of physiological research. Salt is not simply a flavor enhancer. It is genuinely inseparable from basic human biological function. This same understanding eventually produced modern nutritional science's more complicated relationship with salt. Researchers established that while adequate sodium intake remains essential for survival, modern diets, heavy in processed foods, frequently provide considerably more than the human body actually needs, contributing to genuine long-term health concerns for many people. Contemporary public health guidance reflects this nuanced reality. Salt is simultaneously essential and, in excess, a legitimate health consideration. Salt's scientific relevance extends well beyond human biology. Engineers developed large-scale desalination technology, capable of converting seawater into usable fresh drinking water by separating out dissolved salt through increasingly sophisticated filtration processes. This technology has become genuinely transformative for water-scarce coastal regions worldwide, enabling agricultural and urban development that would otherwise be entirely impossible in certain arid environments. More recently, researchers have discovered an entirely unexpected application: salt's remarkable capacity to store thermal energy. Molten salt energy storage systems now capture solar energy during daylight hours, releasing it steadily after sunset, addressing one of renewable energy's persistent practical challenges. It is a genuinely striking modern application for a mineral whose fundamental chemistry has not changed since it first crystallized in ancient seas. From an ancient hunter's first curious taste to a hospital's most routine treatment, from ocean water to stored solar energy, salt's scientific applications continued expanding in directions no earlier civilization could have anticipated, and yet, remarkably, its most basic and enduring role. Modern life remains something almost embarrassingly ordinary, keeping roads safe during winter and pantries stocked year-round. Think back to that ancient herd migrating instinctively toward a mineral outcrop, long before humans existed to notice them doing it. That same instinct, that same fundamental chemistry, is still playing out today, just now, at a scale those first curious hunter-gatherers could never have imagined. Every winter, municipal trucks spread millions of tons of rock salt across roads throughout colder regions of the world, preventing countless traffic accidents through the same basic chemistry that let ancient humans preserve their first pieces of meat. Salt disrupts ice formation, lowering water's freezing point on contact. It is an unglamorous, thoroughly modern application built on genuinely ancient science. This convenience does come with real environmental trade-offs. Researchers have documented salt's measurable impact on nearby waterways, soil, and vegetation, prompting engineers to develop more precise application technology and alternative treatments designed to reduce excess use, while maintaining essential winter road safety. It is a thoroughly modern challenge, balancing genuine practical necessity against ecological responsibility, a negotiation ancient salt traders never had to consider. Meanwhile, Vestancian salt flats, the same kind of formations that provided rock salt to those legendary Saharan caravans, have found an entirely unexpected new purpose. Beneath their blindingly white surfaces, several of the world's largest flats also contain substantial lithium deposits, now being extracted for batteries powering electric vehicles and renewable energy storage. The same geological process that created ancient salt is now, quite literally, helping power humanity's transition toward cleaner energy. Consider, for a moment, everything this single mineral has genuinely touched. It preserved a pharaoh's body for eternity. It fed Roman legions and gave us the word salary. It funded trans-Saharan empires and medieval Venetian power. It sparked genuine revolutionary anger in France. It carried explorers safely across oceans. It became essential industrial chemistry, purified drinking water for millions, and now helps store the energy that may power our future. And every single one of those achievements traces back to the same basic biological truth. Animal bodies, including our own, require sodium to function, and salt happens to be the most reliable, abundant way nature ever provided it. Here is the thought worth carrying with you after this documentary ends. Salt never needed humanity to become valuable. It was always essential, sitting quietly in rock formations, ocean water, and underground springs, indifferent to whether anyone noticed. What humanity contributed was simply curiosity, the willingness to watch an animal's strange migration, to taste an unfamiliar crystal, and to ask what else this remarkable mineral might be capable of. The next time you reach for the salt shaker, glance at a winter road, or simply drink a glass of clean water, remember what you are actually engaging with, not just a seasoning, not just a mineral. You are touching roughly the entire span of human civilization, still quietly working, exactly the way it always has, one crystal at a time.